Neil's reaction to such attempts at persuasion depended on who was making it. When it was an ordinary witness, he found it merely irritating. When someone who had received a miracle cure told him to love God, he had to restrain an impulse to strangle the person. But what he found most disquieting of all was hearing the same suggestion from a man named Tony Crane. Tony's wife had died in the visitation too, and he now projected an air of groveling with his every moment. In hushed, tearful tones he explained how he had accepted his role as one of God's subjects, and he advised Neil to do likewise. Neil didn't stop attending the meetings. He felt that he somehow owed it to Sarah to stick with them, but he found another group to go to as well, one more compatible with his own feelings. A support group devoted to those who'd lost a loved one during a visitation and were angry at God because of it. They met every other week in a room at the local community center and talked about the grief and rage that boiled inside of them. All the attendees were generally sympathetic to one another, despite differences in their various attitudes toward God. Of those who'd been devout before their loss, some struggled with the task of remaining so, while others gave up their devotion without a second glance. Of those who'd never been devout, some felt their position had been validated, while others were faced with the near impossible task of becoming devout now. Neil found himself, to his consternation, in this last category. Like every other non-devout person, Neil had never expended much energy on where his soul would end up. He'd always assumed his destination was hell, and he accepted that. That was the only thing, the way of things, and hell, after all, was not physically worse than the moral plane. It meant permanent exile from God, no more and no less. The truth of this was plain for anyone to see on those occasions when hell manifested itself. These happened on a regular basis. The ground seemed to become transparent, and you could see hell as if you were looking through a hole in the floor. The lost souls looked no different than the living, their eternal bodies resembling mortal ones. You couldn't communicate with them. Their exile from God meant that they couldn't apprehend the mortal plane where his actions were still felt. But as long as the manifestation lasted, you could hear them talk, laugh, or cry just as they had when they were alive. People varied widely in their reactions to these manifestations. Most devout people were galvanized not by the sight of anything frightening, but at the beginning reminded that eternity outside paradise was a possibility. Neil, by contrast, was one of those who were unmoved. As far as he could tell, the lost souls as a group were no unhappier than he was. Their existence no worse than his in the mortal plane, and in some ways better. His eternal body would be unhampered by congenital abnormalities. Of course, everyone knew that heaven was incomparably superior, but to Neil it had always seemed too remote to consider, like wealth or fame or glamour. For people like him, hell was where you went when you died, and he saw no point in restructuring his life in hopes of avoiding that. And since God hadn't previously played a role in Neil's life, he wasn't afraid of being exiled from God. The prospect of living without interference, living in a world where windfalls and misfortunes were never by design, held no terror for him. Now that Sarah was in heaven, his situation had changed. Neil wanted more than anything to be reunited with her, and the only way to get to heaven was to love God with all his heart. This is Neil's story, but telling it properly requires telling the stories of two other individuals whose past became entwined with this. The first of these is Janice Riley. What people assumed about Neil had in fact happened to Janice. When Janice's mother was 8 months pregnant with her, she lost control of the car she was driving and collided with a telephone pole during a sudden hailstorm. Fists of ice dropping out of a clear blue sky and littering the road like a spill of giant ball bearings. She was sitting in her car, shaken but unhurt, when she saw a knot of silver flames, later identified as the angel Bardiel, float across the sky. The sight petrified her, but not so much that she didn't notice the peculiar settling sensation in her womb. A subsequent ultrasound revealed that the unborn Janice Riley no longer had legs. Flipper like feet grew directly from her hip sockets. Janice's life might have gone the way of Neil's, if not for what happened 2 days after the ultrasound. Janice's parents were sitting at their kitchen table, crying and asking why they had done to deserve this. When they received the vision, the saved souls of four deceased relatives appeared before them, suffusing the kitchen with a golden glow. The saved never spoke, but their beatific smiles induced a feeling of serenity in whoever saw them. From that moment on, the Rileys were certain that their daughter's condition was not a punishment. As a result, Janice grew up thinking of her legless condition as a gift. Her parents explained that God had given her a special assignment because he considered her equal to the task, and she vowed that she would not let him down. Without pride or defiance, she saw it as her responsibility to show others that her condition did not indicate weakness, but rather strength. As a child, she was fully accepted by her schoolmates. When you're as pretty, confident, and charismatic as she was, children don't even notice that you are in a wheelchair. It was when she was a teenager that she realized that the able bodied people in her school were not the ones who most needed convincing. It was more important for her to set an example for other handicapped individuals, whether they had been touched by God or not, no matter where they lived. Janice began speaking before audiences, telling those with disabilities that they had the strengths God required for them. Over time, she developed a reputation and a following. She made a living writing and speaking and established a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting her message. People sent her letters thanking for her for changing their lives, and receiving those gave her a sense of fulfillment of a sort that Neil had never experienced. This was Janice's life up until she herself witnessed a visitation by the angel Rachel. She was letting herself into her house when the tremors began. At first she thought they were natural origin, although she didn't live in a geologically active area, and waited in the doorway for them to subside. Several seconds later, she caught a glimpse of silver in the sky and realized it was an angel just before she lost consciousness. Janice awoke to the biggest surprise of her life, the sight of her two new legs, long, muscular, and fully functional. She was startled the first time she stood up. She was taller than she expected. Balancing at such a height without the use of her arms was unnerving, and simultaneously feeling the texture of the ground through the soles of her feet made it positively bizarre. Rescue workers, finding her wandering down the street dazedly, thought she was in shock until she, marveling at her ability to face them at eye level, explained to them what had happened. When statistics were gathered for the visitation, the restoration of Janice's legs was recorded as a blessing, and she was humbly grateful for her good fortune. It was at the first of the support group meetings that a feeling of guilt began to creep in. There, Janice met two individuals with cancer who had witnessed Rachel's visitation, thought their cure was at hand, and been bitterly disappointed when they realized they'd been passed over. Janice found herself wondering, why had she received a blessing when they had not? Janice's family and friends considered the restoration of her legs a reward for excelling at the task God had set for her. But for Janice, this interpretation raised another question. Did he intend for her to stop? Surely not. Evangelism provided the central direction of her life, and there was no limit to the number of people who needed to hear her message. Her continuing to preach was the best action she could take, both for herself and for others.